let's talk a little bit about biosocial theory and sort of the way that biotheorists have kind of incorporated the biology side and the social side together. Which, if you haven't seen the video on the foundations of trait theory, which goes into explaining why purely biological theories are very problematic, definitely go check that one out first. But biosocial theories in general basically bring together the idea that you have this combination between the physical, the environmental, and the social conditions that all kind of work together to produce human behavior, including criminal behavior. And so this is about the link between the physical and mental traits, the social environment, and our behavior. So a lot of things are said to affect behavior, and we can talk about this from sort of a biochemical kind of perspective. And this is something that these types of biochemical conditions may affect people throughout their life course. And so if we think back to the diathesis stress model, this is about the things that affect somebody's predisposition. And so it's the sort of the biological side, which would be, some people have a higher predisposition to criminality, but then that sort of combines with experience and learning and environmental factors and situational factors and whatnot. But there are a lot of things that are said to affect behavior, such as the onset and the persistence of smoking and drinking, exposure to harmful chemicals, so things like lead or food additives. Certainly, it used to be a thing that lead-based paint was used, and a big sort of revelation happened when they realized that, lead is poisonous and it kind of damages us, because they were using lead-based paint on children's toys. And so they stopped doing that after they realized, it's kind of a bad thing to do, because kids put toys in their mouths and they were getting lead poisoning. In very small amounts, but enough to affect behavior, at least that's the theory. But also there's things like if you don't get enough of the good chemicals and the minerals that you need at the right time, so things like getting calcium and proteins at the right time during development and things like that. There are also theories about how diet affects behavior, including the amount of sugar intake. There's a lot about sort of more sugar leads to more problems kind of thing, especially that also, again, has to do with at certain times. Also, hormones. Hormones absolutely affect behavior, especially androgens. It's essentially the male sex hormones like testosterone, but also adrenaline. Adrenaline is another one that has been the focus of certain research, because it's said that adrenaline increases as the body tries to deal with like heat stress, and so there's a whole lot of things that can potentially combine here. And so then we can sort of think about how those things are related to things like impulsivity and aggression. So certainly when we're talking about the male sex hormones, there's been a lot of research looking at testosterone, and that's sort of where the criminal chromosome idea came in, because that was men that were born with an extra Y chromosome, so they were XYY instead of just XY. They were assumed to have more testosterone, which may or may not be true, but that was sort of deemed the criminal chromosome, that you're definitely destined to be a criminal if you have that, which has since been debunked. There may be a connection there to higher levels of testosterone, but that absolutely does not equate to you are a criminal because you have this gene. So these various biochemical conditions have been shown to increase crime to varying degrees. So there has been relationship shown, but with sort of any of these biochemical conditions, but generally it's a case-by-case basis. So, for example, if you look at a certain case, well, maybe if we go back in their history, they were exposed to that lead-based paint as kids, and maybe that can explain, why they have this predisposition to violence and why we see them in the criminal justice system. And so, on a case-by-case, we can basically use these things to explain it, but we can't explain all crimes or even crime trends necessarily using this kind of information. A lot of things could affect crime, but it often takes multiple of these factors to actually produce a criminal, which is why biosocial theory kind of combines more than just any one of these factors. So relatedly, the field of neurophysiology has kind of looked at the effects of essentially problems in the brain and kind of how that can affect criminality, which is it's like a biological approach, but again, it's this idea that this is about increasing predisposition and increasing likelihood in certain individuals. It doesn't equate to people necessarily leading a criminal lifestyle because of a certain neurophysiological deficit. But essentially from this, when we sort of look at this, neurophysiology in general, and any impairment in executive brain function is potentially related to aggressive behavior. And so this is basically the idea that if there is something wrong that affects your executive brain functioning, then your chances of aggressive behavior are going to be higher. Same with your chances of impulsivity and things like that, because if your brain basically isn't working the way that it's supposed to be, or there's some kind of impairment, it's going to cause problems. And I mean, that makes sense. However, this then begs the question about, well, how do we measure these impairments? And that's not a simple answer. There's actually a whole lot of ways that we can measure neurological impairment. And so there's some like direct tests like the EEG, which records electrical impulses given off by the brain. And then there's a whole bunch of other brain scans like the PET and the BEAM and the SPECT and the SQUID and all the specific types of brain scans. But that's sort of a more direct biological approach that isn't necessarily it's not necessarily available to anybody who wants to use it. But there's other ways that we can measure neurological impairment in a less like biologically direct way. And this would be through things like tests, like memorization visual awareness tests, auditory memory tests, verbal IQ tests. So this is basically specific questions that are geared towards determining where an impairment might be and where in the brain that might be and how that's affecting, whether it's, speech or memory or whatever. It's that idea that if we can see where problems are based on an inability to answer certain types of questions, then we can figure out where in the brain the impairment is most likely to be. So there have been some neurophysiological conditions that have been discussed as they relate to criminal behavior. MBDs in general, these are essentially they're episodic, explosive impulsivity or rage. Often you'll have these people they're warm, they're nice people between these episodes of violence. And so this is going to include disorders like explosive rage disorder. But this is basically any time you have this abruptly appearing, really not great behavior that happens, and it interrupts the individual's lifestyle. It doesn't represent their normal behavior or their normal personality, and it's just sort of a trigger that goes off in their brain, causes an outburst, and then they kind of get over it and get back to regular life. But it's this episodic. So something like explosive rage disorder, you'll have explosive rage happen, and then they go back to normal. And that interval varies from individual to individual in terms of how often it happens. But it's something clicking in the brain. So then obviously, while they're having these episodes of explosive rage, let's say, then that's going to cause problems. And so that can explain, for those individuals that have this condition, and if it manifests that way, that can help explain their behavior. Similarly, there's been a lot of research looking at the effects of learning disabilities. And so learning disabilities, this is anything that essentially makes it more difficult to understand or use language, either in written or oral form. And so this includes a whole bunch of different specific types, but essentially anything that hinders that understanding or using of language. And so some of the side effects of learning disorders are things like impulsivity. It's harder to learn from experience. Sometimes this goes along with poor social skills, not always. But the biggest area where learning disabilities have been connected to crime and criminality is through school failure. And so if it makes it harder for somebody to succeed in their academics, whether we're talking from a young child all the way through to post-secondary, if it makes it difficult to succeed and failure is higher, then that's going to be related to crime, because this leads to decreased career opportunities, leads to problems with self-image. And so people develop negative self-image because they feel like they're failures and they can't succeed where everybody else, it's so easy for them. This leads to acting out behavior, especially in youths. And so it's not the learning disability itself that is connected to crime so much as the side effects of the learning disability via school failure. So another one that I'm sure people have heard of is ADHD. And so ADHD is essentially where it's difficult to focus, but then, so ADD is just without the hyperactivity component. That also can cause problems, but that hyperactivity element kind of amps things up a little bit in terms of being related to acting out behavior and criminal behavior. But people with ADHD, especially at a certain severity, it's lower attention spans, higher impulsivity, obviously more hyperactivity. It's right there in the name. So people with ADHD are more likely to act out. They're more likely to use drugs and alcohol, and then they're more likely to be arrested. And if they're arrested, they're more likely to be arrested multiple times. So there is a connection there, and it comes down to how it's handled. And so if ADHD is diagnosed early and appropriately addressed, it doesn't have to be a problem. But if it's not appropriately addressed, that seems to be where there's an issue. And then, of course, if there's tumors, lesions, injury, disease, basically anything that makes it so, in general, if your brain isn't working the way that it should be or the way that it used to be, that's going to cause some problems, both in terms of mentally and behaviorally. And so depending on where a tumor is, where a lesion might be, where an injury targets, where the disease is affecting the brain, it's all going to vary from individual to individual. But again, on a case-by-case basis, this could be how we explain why person X, committed these types of crimes. And so these can come from personality changes. Sometimes it causes hallucinations or psychotic episodes, again, depending on the severity and the location of the damage. It could alternatively go the other way and lead to depression. But then we can see things like temper outbursts and violence and things like that. It's, again, a case by case. There is no, you have this tumor, so you are going to behave this way. It's just almost a backward way of explaining why somebody potentially became a criminal. So for that individual, this was the relevant thing. So that's kind of when we use biosocial theories in general. A lot of it comes down to, we can use it to explain why somebody became a criminal, but it's a lot harder to predict it, and because there are so many other factors involved.